Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. If you are given 1 hour, you prepare a PowerPoint. 15 minutes, you improvise. 5 minutes, you better stick to your notes. For someone who's known Mike Mingos for more than 35 years, and as the head of the Division for Chemical Sciences of our academy, I'm particularly delighted and honored to congratulate him on our behalf on the occasion of this Blaise Pascal Medal. Mike has made groundbreaking contribution to science and chemistry in particular through this mastering of theoretical computational chemistry associated with synthetic breakthroughs. It's very rare to have in one person these two very different facets of chemistry together. And this has led to a dimension that very few people reach, and his name is known worldwide by the students. And I will try to summarize briefly for you the reason for that. And I will try to divide the landscape in 3 parts. First, Mike as a scientist. He has more than 500 papers in his records dealing with a huge diversity of topics dealing with chemistry. Coordination chemistry, organometallic chemistry, cluster chemistry, clustered molecular beams, boron chemistry, chemical bonding, microwave techniques. He was one of the pioneers to use microwave for synthetic chemistry catalysis, work on molecular recognition, and he has really greatly influenced a number of people worldwide. After a PhD with Joe Chatt, a giant in chemistry in the UK, and a postdoc with Jim Ibers at Northwestern, Mike was the first to study the bonding mode of a very specific molecule, a very small one, nitric oxide, nitrosyl, that forms complexes with transition metals, and analyzing in particular the bending of nitric oxide when coordinated to metal centers. And this has relevance to biofunctions that this molecule has. NO is one of the molecules of life. At that time, nobody knew that NO would turn out to be a very important neurotransmitter. So sometimes when you do things, you'll be surprised in retrospect to see the impact of the work you've done without necessarily knowing all the implication it has. It's very rare for an inorganic chemist to have his name associated with contributions linking his name with specific compounds or theories. And this has happened with Mike, and he has his name associated to 2 major rules that all the students have to learn during their curriculum, particularly rationalizing the structure of metal clusters in relationship to the number of electrons available in the molecule. And he had a groundbreaking paper in Nature, 1972. The title was The General Theory for Cluster and Ring Compounds of the Main Group and Transition Elements. And that paper illustrates very elegantly the unique way Mike Mingos performed his research, combining experimental chemistry with theory, boron chemistry with transition metals, and providing a rationale for observations that were sort of scattered and unexplained. This is a very rare approach, and I can think of another chemist who has a similar way of tackling science, is Roald Hoffmann, the Nobel laureate, 1981. And there is no wonder that Roald Hoffmann and Mike Mingos collaborated for many years. And they had a joint paper in 1976 entitled A Comparative Bonding Study of Conical Fragments. I won't go into the details of the chemistry, but that set the basis for what is now called the isolobal analogy. It's a way to explain why fragments that are similar in terms of electronic properties can actually be analyzed in a common way and rationalize a number of structures that otherwise look totally disconnected. And this was probably one of the most important conceptual developments in the 1970s. And this isolobal analogy was actually chosen by Roald Hoffmann when he prepared his Nobel lecture, which was published as every year in Angewandte Chemie. Mike has studied metal clusters of all kinds, all structures, and has linked that with systems based on platinum and gold, which usually are exceptions to the basic rules. And I think cold chemistry will be the highlight of his talk, so I won't go more into the details. So his work, particularly his book on the Introduction to Cluster Chemistry, have become classics that students and researchers have used worldwide. The second element I would like to emphasize concerning Mike is Mike as a teacher and a mentor. In addition to the research contributions he has made, which are just spectacular, he has trained a number of PhD students and postdocs who all valued tremendously his mentorship, his way of doing research, his rigor and ethics. And the way he writes papers is quite unique. You know, when you read them, even if it's complicated matters, you think you're becoming intelligent. And this is also reflected in the clarity of these lectures, including for undergrad students. We really love this way of presenting the chemistry and the science. Very dedicated to teaching, also to the communication of science. He has been involved very much in editorial matters. I think he has edited more than 100 books, which is quite amazing, and served on a number of editorial boards. The third aspect I would like to evoke briefly on Mike's is a man of culture. His broad interests outside chemistry and science are also a very strong characteristic of his personality. His ability and talent to interact with people from diversified backgrounds is truly impressive. His interest for European history, for architecture, just to name a few areas, may be related to his Greek backgrounds. Interestingly, the geometry of metal clusters, of which he has spent so much of his life, tetrahedra, octahedra, are just enjoy the beauty of Plato's polyhedra. And they have inspired alchemists and artists and scientists for centuries. Finally, he became, after having been at Imperial College, full professor for many years in London, he became the principal of St. Edmund Hall in Oxford for 10 years. And that speaks for itself. To occupy so successfully a position like that requires specific and new talent. He's an honorary fellow of St. Edmund Hall and of Keble College in Oxford. And not surprisingly, Mike has received a number of national awards, a Fellow of the Royal Society, national, international prizes and awards. And I think it's just appropriate that he now receives the Blaise Pascal Medal of our Academy. It couldn't be a better candidate and a better choice for this very distinguished honor, and we're very glad to congratulate Mike on that.
In England, we have an expression that behind many great men is a surprised family. So my family is very surprised by this honor. I'm even more surprised, and I'm humbled by this honor that you've given me. Now, we've had an excellent introduction from Professor Balzani about chemistry, but I realize that the audience here is drawn from many backgrounds, from medicine to social sciences, effectively. And so I'm not going to try and cover very complicated things in this, but to try and bring about a simple analysis of a particular sort of problem, which will give you some idea of the way in which I think about chemistry, and I hope some of the contributions that have come out of it. Leonardo was the starting point for Professor Balzani's lecture. Michael Faraday is going to be the starting point of my talk because he was the first chemist to actually, we always associate Faraday with electricity and magnetism, but he was a chemist. And I did notice actually in Leonardo's list of attributes, the one that wasn't there was alchemy actually. Practically everything is there besides that. But Michael Faraday was a wonderful chemist and physicist in a sense, a very practical man too. And he was the first to discover what we call colloids these days, solutions of gold formed by reduction of solutions containing gold compounds which have high colors. And so, although this work was done more than 150 years ago, some of the samples which he prepared at that time are still to be found at the Royal Institution in London, and there's a specific example showing that sort of purplish color associated with the gold colloid. He, of course, besides having the practical knowledge to make these things, speculated on their nature, and subsequently, with others, we now recognize colloids as a very important division of chemistry, whereby, for example, something like a metal like gold actually in this colloidal state retains some of the properties of the parent metal and yet can form solutions that are highly colored. And it's associated with having, of course, some particles of the metal there, but in some way, which wasn't understood until more recently, stabilizing them in such a way that they could dissolve in water. And so just to give you a simplified picture of it, at the center of a gold colloid or a platinum colloid, there are thousands and thousands of metal atoms, but in order to stop these coming together, aggregating to form the bulk metal, something has to repel them. And it's usually charges, as I've represented here, which stops these particles containing 10 to the 6th to 10 to the 11th numbers of atoms together. And so, for reasons which were discussed this morning, there is a great deal of interest in small colloids that could be produced in a reproducible way. One thing about Faraday's colloids is that they come not as one molecular compound, but a whole range with different sizes. And so if you're going to begin to think about technologically developing nanotechnology based on these metals, then of course you have to have syntheses which are reproducible and produce identifiable and unique molecular species. And so if we think about on the right-hand side Faraday's colloids, and as you decrease the size, eventually what you hope to get is a nanoparticle with interesting properties, but yet a selected range of masses, or ideally just one mass number. And then on the left-hand side is the area that I want to describe to you today, is nanoclusters which contain several, up to maybe hundreds of metal atoms, but a molecular species. And those we would describe as nanoclusters, or if they're on a smaller scale, clusters. So Faraday made these compounds by reducing an agent. So the first question I want to address is what determines the size of this colloid or the cluster compound? And what we found when we first started working in this area is obviously Faraday talked about the charges around, but it took on a more molecular dimension when we realized that you could get these cluster compounds by using ligands. These are small molecules that are able to donate electron pairs to these metal clusters and bind to them sufficiently strongly that you form a species like a Malteser with chocolate on the outside and a substance in the center. And so, given that, the steric requirements of the cluster of the ligand are very important. And this was one of the first areas where we made a contribution. There gives you, I talked about these ligands. Specifically, these are phosphine ligands. So triphenylphosphine, PPH3, was a common ligand, and the compounds were first discovered in Italy by the Malatesta group in Milan. And the reducing agents commonly used are sodium borohydride, which would be very commonly available in an organic or inorganic laboratory. And so now, as a result of various people who I've mentioned there, you can see that you can form many of these cluster compounds with varying numbers of ligands and varying numbers of metal atoms. In other words, you can control, to a great extent, the nuclearity of the cluster. And we rationalize this by, chemists are very familiar with steric effects, the size of the ligand being very important in chemistry. And in coordination chemistry, they have a cone angle which defines the size of the ligand. And so we developed what's described as a cluster cone angle, which is defined from the center of the cluster, but is interrelated to it and is able to define the steric crowding requirements of the ligand. And of course, the smaller the ligand, the higher the nuclearity of the cluster is. In other words, you can form a cluster with a smaller ligand with more metal atoms. And so we put this on a mathematical sort of scale, if you like. The cluster cone angle, of course, depends on the icosahedron, or whether it's an octahedron. As the number of metal atoms moves to the right, you have more metal atoms, 12 metal atoms in an icosahedron, and you can see that the cluster cone angle is rather smaller for that than for a tetrahedron. And so consequently, you can relate the size of the ligand to these cluster cone angles and begin to establish what size of metal atom you'd form in these cluster compounds. I'm very pleased today, actually, that Hubert Schmidbauer is in the audience, come all the way from Munich, because on the next slide is one of his compounds, which shows this principle very nicely. It's a molecular compound, and it has in the center 4 gold atoms in the arrangement of a tetrahedron, and then a very bulky tributyl phosphine ligand on the outside, which prevents more metal atoms fitting in between them. We used this principle to form the first icosahedral gold compound by using a much smaller phosphine ligand. And that's shown on the next slide. You can see in yellow and blue an icosahedron of gold atoms. The blue is in the central site, making a 13th metal atom. And then this ligand has methyl-phenyl ligands on it, and therefore has a much smaller cluster cone angle, and so consequently one is able to form a larger cluster. This has 13 metal atoms rather than the 4 in the previous example. Now, this principle has been taken on recently to go to even smaller ligands, and so if you use, instead of a phosphine ligand, a thiol ligand, SR group, that has an even smaller cluster cone angle, and then you can move up to much larger clusters shown on here. And this brings me to an important point, that when Faraday was making these, he'd get a large dispersion of clusters of different sizes. As you begin to move into this molecular area, you don't always get a pure compound immediately. Nature's not so fortunate in its behavior with us, but sometimes simple chemical procedures like using different solvents, can separate two of these molecular cluster compounds, and once they're separated, you can crystallize them and establish their structures. So these are some examples now with these thiol ligands of moving up to a much larger scale the number of metal atoms in these molecular cluster species. The largest, I think, on that slide. I might say, this is the only time I've actually lectured in the sunshine because the sun is beaming on me. It gives me a sort of biblical appearance, I should think, to you. But I hope not. So, it means that I have difficulty reading the slides from here. But nonetheless, I think it's 102, the highest on that. Now, the next thing, we talked about the charges in Faraday's sort of work. What determines the charge? Well, in part, it's so the ligands like thiols have a -1 charge on them, whereas phosphines have a neutral, no charge on them. So the ligand charge plays a part. But of course, what we found out very early on is that the total charge on the cluster depends on the metal atoms interacting with each other to form a spherical shell through covalent bonds, delocalized covalent bonds. And this shell structure, just like the atomic shell structure, has characteristic closed shell electronic configurations. And really, that's part of my contribution over the years, as Pierre so kindly mentioned in his introduction. And those are just references, just to show that I am quoting published work. Pauling used to always be told that he would always have this wonderful story about chemical bonding, but would say to people, well, I'll publish the details later. It's just to prove to you that some of the details have been published already. Now, what determines the polyhedral geometry? Now, that's an interesting question for a chemist, and so that we spent quite a lot of time in order to try and find out what determines these closed shell structures. And with a single spherical surface, you tend to get deltahedral clusters because those numbers of metal atoms can share the number of electrons which are in deficiency as effectively as possible. So if you don't have much food, you try and share it with your neighbors, is the principle involved there, really. And so going to Hubert Schmitzbauer's compound, you can imagine that if you have 4 metal atoms, gold atoms, the primary bonding occurs for gold through its 6s orbitals. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to ignore the rest. And if they are arranged tetrahedrally, you get 1 very stable orbital, like an s orbital, and 3 antibonding orbitals, which look like p orbitals. And so the spherical structure for an atom based on gold is very similar to that of the hydrogen atom, which you will be familiar from your undergraduate days. And so a gold cluster of this sort is going to have a closed shell when there are 2 electrons that occupy the s shell. And that's exactly what's found in Professor Schmitzbauer's compounds, because it has the formula Au4 phosphine 4, 1 electron coming from each gold, and the 2+ charge reduces that electron count to 2 for filling that S shell perfectly. We've also prepared compounds which are isoelectronic, but slightly less symmetrical, showing that the symmetry is not so important as the basic topology. What happens if you have a partially filled shell? And that's interesting. With an S shell, you can't have a partially filled shell unless you have only 1 electron, and all of these have even numbers of electrons. But once you start occupying the P shell, then, of course, you have the opportunity to have a partially filled shell because it requires 6 electrons to complete the shell. And so in the spherical geometry, you could technically fill the shell by occupying the S shell and 6 electrons going into the P shell. But if you have a partially filled shell, then the molecule distorts either to give a prolate or an oblate geometry, and this is reflected in the number of electrons associated with the shell filling. And so you can see for 2 electrons in the P shell, it's a prolate structure preferred, then an oblate structure, and then the spherical structure with 6. And so you begin to see how you can develop patterns amongst these cluster compounds that give you some idea of underlying principles. And that just summarizes what I've said in words. And here are some specific examples. Starting from the tetrahedron, you can get a gold 6 cluster that you can see is clearly prolate, and also a second example of prolate. And then with the gold 7, where you've got 2 additional electrons, then it squashes to give a very squashed oblate structure. Now, this is an interesting question. So you can see how one can begin to develop patterns about the structures of these compounds in the solid state. But a very important question is, are these structures rigid, as if they have strong metal wires in a molecular model, or are they much softer? And so that's very important, because if you start building generalizations and find that the potential energy is very soft, then you have to have a much more flexible model than that based on rigid lines. And so we were able to address this using modern techniques, first X-ray crystallography and then nuclear magnetic resonance structure. Nuclear magnetic resonance has the great advantage is that you can study the solid as well as the solution phase of these gold clusters. So you can tell whether they're rigid only in the solid, but also in the solution phase. The first indication that suggested these might be quite soft, the potential energy surface, was a Pasteur-like experiment whereby one of my students, who was very able, Kevin Hall, noticed when he made one of these gold cluster compounds that there were 2 sorts of crystals and with different colors. And he separated them just like Pasteur did, and we did the structures of both of them. And they're shown here. You can see they both have 9 gold atoms, each with the hatched lines, the phosphorus atoms of the phosphine ligands, but their architectures are quite different. And so you've got an isomerism, a skeletal isomerism here, whereby the metal atoms take up different arrangements in some of these gold cluster compounds. The one on the left looks a bit like a sulfur molecule with an atom in the center, and the other looks much more like a fragment of an icosahedron. That's why they have different colors, because they have different electronic spectral characteristics. And we've also studied these compounds in the solution phase and the solid phase using 31P NMR. And you can see that most of the symmetrical clusters are pretty rigid in the solid state, but become more mobile in the solution phase. But the compounds where we got the 2 isomers, the gold-brown isomer and the green isomer, are actually rigid in the solid state, but are very fluxional in the solution phase. So the gold atoms are migrating around at quite a rapid rate in those compounds. But for the larger icosahedral, symmetrical, spherical structures, They are rigid at room temperature in solution, but they become non-rigid if you raise the temperature. And this is just to show you the actual raw data, but I don't think that's the solid state NMR. Now, the next thing to talk about is that if these things are going to develop into materials, either for electronics or other applications, the band gap in these spherical molecular clusters is important. And at what stage does the band gap become zero, and therefore it takes on metallic properties? And you can see the calculated band gaps here for a series of gold clusters with phosphines and thiol ligands. And you can see that the band gap gets smaller as the cluster gets larger, which you would expect. But even with the bottom cluster, which is 120 odd metal atoms, the band gap is still half an electron volt. So we've not reached that metallic state, and probably won't till about 200 metal atoms, where the core can be described as being a metallic in nature. But nonetheless, I think most theoreticians wouldn't be surprised by this, that the band gap is getting smaller as you go from a molecular species to a metallic type species. Now, another interesting question from a chemist's point of view, but it might have technological implications too, is that if you have, I've concentrated on just having gold there, what happens if you have silver or copper also in this cluster? Do they go in a disorganized fashion within the shell, or do they occupy chemically sensible positions? Well, we've done, fortunately, doing this sort of work, you can begin to introduce these metal atoms into the cluster, and using common chemical routes, you can begin to replace some of the gold atoms and form gold-13 clusters, but with substituents of copper, silver, or gold in those icosahedral metal atoms. You can introduce by this route, for example, 2, 3, or 4 heteroatoms, and then do their structures, because that tells you whether they're disordered or regular, and then establish their positions. So there's the structure of one of them. It's not a disordered alloy. It actually has the silver or copper atoms in apical positions of the icosahedron. And when you go to one with 4 silver or copper atoms, this one's the silver example, you can see, again, the same icosahedral structure, but with the silver atoms occupying regular positions. But note, those silver atoms are all on the surface of the cluster. They don't take the position of the interstitial gold atom. In contrast, if you introduce platinum, that goes for the interstitial site, as these 2 examples show. And so, again, a chemist begins to think about this, and it's quite a simple model that you can propose. For an icosahedron, the central metal atom is bonded to 12 other metal atoms, whereas the surface ones are bonded to 6. And so there's a 2-to-1 ratio. If you form strong metal-metal bonds, then you put the metal atom in the center, whereas if you form weaker metal-metal bonds, they go on the surface. And so silver, which forms weaker metal-metal bonds, forms the surface structure. Platinum, which forms stronger metal-metal bonds, occupies the interstitial site. I think that covers that. Let me just see. Yes, I think it's about time. Well, I was going to discuss the role of interstitial atoms a bit more, but I'm going to move on a bit to come to the end, because I've tried for pedagogical reasons, to show you this area and introduce you to this area in terms of rather simple and maybe predictable ideas. But, of course, in life and in chemistry, nature can be very nice to us sometimes and produce things that are very unpredictable. And so I'll just skip this part and go to the end. And so, for example, I've talked about clusters of gold atoms. When we did the move from phosphorus and sulfur ligands to alkyne ligands, these alkynyl ligands of gold, you find that they don't form a cluster compound, but they form something which links them, in a sense, to the previous talk of Professor Balzani, because you have 6 gold atoms with bridging alkyne ligands forming a hexagonal ring. But if you look at the structure, it actually is a catenane. It's 2 rings joined like 2 links of a metal chain, or the Olympic. The blue atoms are of one ring and the red atoms are of another. And so chemistry does have its rules and principles, but in a sense, it also is a wonderful subject for those that are practitioners in it, because it comes up with these wonderful surprises occasionally. And this is one that really surprised me when we first made it, because there had been, for the reasons expressed by Professor Balzani, a lot of interest by supramolecular chemists to form these sort of catenane structures. But this just drops out of a simple reaction with 2 components, gold and the alkynyl ligand. And so that always makes me humble, and just as I'm humbled today to accept this prize from you. Thank you very much indeed.